quiet suburban street at dusk. The camera pans slowly over the neighborhood, capturing the stillness. The sound of distant sirens begins to fade, and every story has a moment. A single, defining second that changes everything. For some, it's a whisper. For others, it's a scream. But for Marcus Johnson, it was the sound of his own voice, breaking as he cried out for his son. This is not just a story about what happened that night. This is a story about what happens when the world watches, when the truth is louder than silence, and when a father's love collides with a system that was never built to protect him. It was a Thursday evening in May, just after 8:17 p.m., in the small town of Crestwood, Illinois, a town where everyone knows your name, but not everyone knows your pain. The air was warm, the kind of night where kids play outside until the streetlights come on. But on this night, the streetlights didn't just signal the end of playtime. They marked the beginning of a nightmare. Jamal Johnson was just a kid, a sophomore at Crestwood High. He loved basketball, video games, and his dad's famous barbecue ribs. He was the kind of kid who held doors open for strangers and always said please and thank you. But on this night, none of that mattered, because Jamal was about to learn a lesson no child should ever have to learn, that the color of his skin could make him a target. Officer Daniel Grayson had been on the force for 6 years. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a question mark. But to Marcus Johnson, he was about to become the face of a system that had failed his family long before this night. In Johnson's mind, it started with a question. "What's in the bag, son?" Jamal answered politely, holding up the chips and soda. But Officer Grayson wasn't satisfied. He asked Jamal to step out of the car. Marcus, watching from the driver's seat, felt his stomach drop. He knew this routine. He'd lived it himself. But this time, it was his son. Marcus begged, "Please, officer, he's just a kid. He didn't do anything wrong." But Officer Grayson wasn't listening. He pushed Jamal against the car, his voice rising. "I said, put your hands on the hood." Jamal, terrified, complied. But when he turned to look at his father, the officer saw it as a threat, and then it happened. A single swing of a baton, a cry of pain, a father's scream. In that moment, the world stopped. For Marcus, it was as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. For Jamal, it was the first time he realized that being a kid wasn't enough to protect him. The incident was caught on camera. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media exploded. News outlets picked it up. Crestwood, a town that had always flown under the radar, was suddenly at the center of a national conversation. But for Marcus and Jamal, it wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about survival. Jamal was rushed to the hospital with a fractured rib and a bruised spirit. Marcus sat in the waiting room, replaying the night in his mind. He thought about all the times he'd told Jamal to be careful, to keep his hands visible, to speak softly. He thought about the world he'd brought his son into, a world where a bag of chips could turn into a life-altering moment. The community rallied, protests erupted, demands for justice grew louder. But for Marcus, justice wasn't just about Officer Grayson. It was about changing a system that allowed this to happen in the first place. It was about making sure no other father had to sit in a hospital waiting room, wondering if his son would be next. Marcus stood before the town council and said what so many had been too afraid to say. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every son, every daughter, every parent who has to worry that their child might not come home tonight because of the color of their skin." Jamal healed, but the scars remained. He went back to school, back to basketball, back to being a kid. But he was different now. He had seen the world for what it was, and it had changed him. But it hadn't broken him. In the end, this story isn't just about pain. It's about resilience. It's about a father and son who refused to let one moment define them. It's about a community that stood up and said, "Enough." Every story has a moment, but it's what we do after that moment that defines us. This is not the end of Jamal and Marcus's story. It's just the beginning. And if their story has touched you, if it's made you think, made you feel, made you want to be part of the change, then don't let it end here. Subscribe, comment, share, because the weight of a moment is only as heavy as the silence that follows it. This is the story of Jamal and Marcus, but it's also the story of us, and it's up to us to decide how it ends.